Welcome back to another episode of On the Air, a podcast brought to you by Stonewater. On the Air brings together key industry figures, colleagues and customers to explore the latest insight and stories. Our host, Paula Palmer, will be joined each episode by a guest co-host, as well as other special guests, bringing their expertise and experience to our conversations about what matters most in social housing.
Hello and welcome to Stonewater's On the Air podcast. In this episode, we're exploring one of the toughest questions facing the housing sector. Who is social housing really for, and how allocation systems can balance fairness, need and practicality? I'm delighted to be joined by Holly Edwards, our Customer Experience Director here at Stonewater, and we've got Tim Brown, Senior Research Associate in Housing and Local Government at Montfort University, Mark Kent, Deputy Executive at Local Space, and last but not least, journalist and housing commentator Peter Apps. Thank you all for joining us, and as always, I'll get you to tell us a bit more about yourselves as we go along. So, Holly and Tim, I'm going to start by getting you to give us a quick intro to yourselves, and then we'll start with finding out about how allocations work and perception of the system. So, Holly, you've been a guest with us here before, but do remind us what you do, please.
So, hi Paula, thanks so much for having me this evening. So, I'm Holly Edwards. I am Customer Experience Director here at Stonewater. And I work within the customer experience department and look after the national lettings team, national income team, commercial services and rents and service charges. So definitely allocations is key within my remit. So it's a great topic to be talking about today.
A busy role. Thanks very much, Holly. Thanks for joining us. And over to you, Tim.
Okay, I'm an honorary research associate at Montfort University, where I used to run a Centre for Comparative Housing Research. I'm also a part-time consultant with Housing Quality Network, and one of my areas of interest is allocations, and I produce a monthly update for Housing Quality Network. My claim to fame or infamy on allocations is that I was partly responsible for the introduction of what is mistakenly called choice-based lettings 25 years ago.
Okay, so I'll perhaps get you to tell us a bit more about that in a minute then, Tim. That's a very interesting start. Thank you very much. Okay, so thanks again for joining us both. Holly, could you give us an outline of how social housing allocations work and how the shortage of the homes plays out in the perception of this?
Yes, of course. So I think probably one thing that's quite key to outline early on is that social housing actually spans a full range of customers. So I think very often when we're talking around allocations, we're speaking about rented and mainly social rent and affordable rent. But actually there's a full range of rented properties and different rent levels that are suited at different customer groups. So what Stonewater do, we work with local authorities in the main around the allocating of our homes. I always hate to use the word allocations. I much prefer using lettings. Allocations is historically around there not being choice for customers. And actually, I think that's one thing that Stonewater is really pushing to do. But working with our local authorities, we deal with housing registers, which is customers who register there as in need. They have waiting lists and some offer choice-based lettings, whereas some offer direct allocations into their properties. Essentially, there's not enough stock. And so what we do find and what has become more prevalent over the most recent years is that whilst many people are in housing need and a need for a more affordable option of homes, actually, the local authorities are forced to then band customers into different groups. And it's only those right at the top of those housing registers that are managing to successfully bid and secure a home. And that's probably fed into the perception around who is social housing for, who is affordable housing for, because there are more customers with increased vulnerabilities that we are housing, but not to say that that's the same in every local authority area and within every home. I think we're definitely saying that social housing is for all. And one thing that's really key for Stonewater in how we create our communities and house customers is the right person, the right place and the right time. That's always our motto when we're assessing applications and against our access to housing, which ultimately is our allocations policy and governs who we move into our homes and where.
Lovely. Thanks, Holly. I think I sort of understood most of what you said there, but I like the interesting sort of bit you said around terminology, around lettings and allocations. And you're right, allocation does sound like have that home, whereas lettings...
Yes.
Yeah, that was really interesting. Thanks. So, Tim, let's get your thoughts on that.
I guess the big issue is fairness, and statutory guidance going back to the mid-1990s flags up fairness, and it includes reasonable preference groups. It includes applicants being able to express their preferences. And, of course, it's about making sure that allocations and lettings follows the equality duties. And fairness crops up in lots of debates about allocations. It was a big theme in the London Assembly's inquiry into allocations last autumn. And it'll be interesting to see when the report is published this year what it says about fairness, because London, of all English cities, has the biggest issue about numbers of household on registers and lack of supply. So I think that will be an acid test. The problem, of course, is putting fairness into practice. In December, what I call the Bible on allocations and homelessness, Jan Luber's book, the 7th edition, came out. And lo and behold, in the foreword, it says, and I'll quote, "Case law shows that protected groups, especially people with disabilities and domestic abuse survivors, are at risk of not being shown fairness." So even though those two groups may be in bands 1 and 2, the issue is that there is still case law, and lots of case law, suggesting that they don't get a fair deal out of allocation. So that brings us to some really fundamental points about it.
Why is that, Tim? Why don't they get a fair chance at allocation or lettings a home?
My take on that is that in many cases, people who have got disabilities and are domestic abuse survivors and people with mental health issues have lots of other issues apart from needing social housing. And is
it because of the added support?
Added support. And can we get the ducks all lined up in one line to meet their needs? And I've been an allocations officer some decades ago, and even then, trying to get a package together that involved health, social services, as it was then called, probably money advice services, was a challenge and a half. And that was when it was relatively straightforward to get social housing through allocations.
Gosh, so maybe going back to that thing that Holly said about right person, right place, right type, that's even harder to get, like you say, the ducks lined up in a row. Okay, gosh. So we're starting to get a better understanding of who social housing is for. Maybe they don't have that ability to find a social housing home by the sounds of it. It's very tricky. And why it's perceived the way it is. But let's not forget our other guests. We've got Mark and Peter here with us too. Welcome to On the Air. Would you tell us a bit more about yourselves as well, please? So, Peter, let's start with you.
Hi, Paula. I'm Peter. I'm a journalist. I've written for a long time for a magazine called Inside Housing, which covers the social and affordable housing sector in the UK. And now I write about these issues across the media, really, so for a variety of newspapers and magazines. And yeah, I think allocations is a kind of a big central part of how social housing operates. So it's good to get the opportunity to talk about it in a bit more detail.
Lovely. Thank you. And yourself, Mark.
Hi, I'm Mark, Deputy CEO at Local Space, and we primarily house households under Part 7 of the homelessness duty that councils have. So we run alongside the general housing list for social housing. Most of our homes are intermediate market rent, not social rent. And IMR wasn't designed for homelessness, but it's become a bit of a safety valve because the system can't cope with the numbers. So we have around 3,000 homes, predominantly working age adults living in our homes. 40% of them have a disability, so still quite high levels of vulnerability. Very diverse, because we're based in East London and Essex, one of the most diverse parts of the country. So while I don't design or operate an allocation system, I do tend to deal with what happens when the system fails.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks both. I'm really interested to get your points of view on this topic. It's great. Right, so Mark, you were sort of telling us there about how your work plays out in sort of the system and emergency housing needs being required by councils in crisis mode. So where do you think the system is breaking down?
Well, I mean, councils are now operating permanently in emergency mode. And, you think about temporary accommodation, it was meant to be short-term, not structural. But hotels and nightly paid accommodation are used because there is nowhere else. So, when you say, where's the system breaking down? I mean, it's 131,000 households in temporary accommodation. That was as of last year. And that's certainly a sign of it, isn't it? And London accounts for something like half of all households in temporary accommodation, even though it's only 16% of the national population. And we work primarily in Newham, which has the highest temporary accommodation rate. Almost 60 households per 1,000 are in temporary accommodation there. So it's not a spike, it's chronic undersupply of viable social and affordable homes is where it breaks down. And local space exists to absorb that failure of the system, not because the model's optimal. We'd rather not exist. We'd rather not be needed. Councils haven't sort of changed their mind about emergency housing. It's just there and growing because supply has collapsed.
Gosh, those numbers you were stating there are staggering, aren't they? The shortage of supply is properly the crux of it. It's not going to be something that gets fixed very quickly, though, unfortunately.
I'm doing some work at the moment in Coventry with some postgraduate architectural students who are looking at providing accommodation and support in a new building for people who are homeless. And I had the opportunity a couple of weeks ago to interview people who were not only homeless but were sofa surfing, living on the streets. And what struck me time and time again was that they were vulnerable for all the reasons I've already said, mental health issues, drug and alcohol abuse thing. But the other issue that struck me was trust. They've been living on the streets, they've been living in a range of rather dubious accommodation, and they have a lack of trust with other people and organisations in society. And I think that's one of the challenges for very vulnerable people is they get into the system for getting social housing, but they don't know who to trust. And I think that's quite a significant issue if we're really going to deal with people who are highly vulnerable.
Okay, that's a really interesting point. Thanks, Tim. Peter, would you tell us about how needs-based lettings in the 1990s shaped today's system? Looking back, what do you think was the biggest unintended consequences of that shift? Is it more than too much demand and too little supply?
So I think we moved to a position, as I understand it, in kind of the late 1970s. There was a lot of sort of rising social awareness about how difficult it was to get a council home for some people, and the big famous film called Cathy Come Home drove some social campaigning on this issue, and so it became local authorities received a duty as a result to house homeless families who applied for help. And on the face of it, that's a good thing, it's a good idea, and it's something which probably prevents destitution for families in a lot of instances, but it does create a problem if the social housing stock you have is very limited, because it means that the council's statutory duty to house homeless people means that it's only really via the homelessness route that you can get into social housing. And obviously for people who are in that kind of critical need, it's a lifeline. For some people, social housing is no longer really an option unless you're in very extreme need in certain areas, not all areas of the country, but in areas where there's very high housing pressures. You can't get a social home at all, and that means you have to look to other means to house yourself. And that was really never the idea of social housing. It was always supposed to be more of a kind of universal social service, more like health or education, which lots of different people at different times in their life would access. So it's come that way, but I think that the problem does come down to, as Mark said, that there's not enough of it. And when a social resource is very limited, then it's probably going to end up going first to the people who need it most.
Thanks, Peter. I think from discussion so far, that's obviously coming down to it. Shortage of supply is making what should be a good system not work very well at all. Holly, earlier you mentioned the right person, right property, right time. What might that look like in practice?
So I think really what it's about is creating sustainable communities. I think building on what Pete mentioned, it's around social housing is there for customers when they need it. Unfortunately, we've moved to a society where actually customers then don't move on from it when maybe they have stabilised their lives and are able to potentially find something in the open market or buy. For us, what's really important is working with the local authorities to, like I say, create those sustainable communities. So in many of the areas, we have certain nominations rights. So that means that the local authority is entitled to nominate to a certain percentage of our homes. And then Stonewater retain the ability to allocate the remainder of the homes to customers at our choosing. We do put most of our properties through the local authority because it's really important for us that actually we are housing those most in need. So even where we maybe have nomination rights that are only 50%, actually we probably put about 90% of all of our homes through waiting for applicants. What we do though is where we have communities that potentially are suffering from particular issues. So, for example, if we have community that's got ASB, unfortunately, happening on the scheme, we take that into account and work with the local authority around a nomination that wouldn't be triggered by such a thing happening around them. So often, like Pete says, some of these customers are coming from crisis. And that then means that moving to a community where something else might be going on could then cause them not to sustain their tenancy. Equally, when we do a lot of new build development where every single one of those homes is allocated through the local authority, it's really important to not just make sure each allocation is correct and each property is suitable for each person, but also the combination of then all of those allocations at the same time and what impact that has. So, for example, you may have, and we have had it before at a new build scheme, for survivors of domestic abuse all allocated for homes in a row next to each other. Actually, that has a combined impact and it's maybe not the right choice. If one of them is to go into crisis, it can trigger along. So, like I say, it's about creating those sustainable communities, noting when our communities are maybe in an area that might require a sensitive let, working with the local authority to say, what do we need to be sensitive to, and asking for someone that's able to meet that. So noting that many of our customers do have vulnerabilities and we need to take those into account. So it's not just about placing someone in a home, it's about placing someone in a home that they can succeed in and really move forward in their life with. Equally, what's really important for us is location. So Mark mentions obviously about London, where we don't operate in London, but actually we work with a number of providers that move people out of London. And that's really important and being seen more and more, but that the support comes with people because it can't just be a solution to move someone to 100 miles away with no family connections, no support, but still consider them housed and ticked off the list. So I think that's one of the really important things about it being the right place as well. It's the right network, the right environment with which someone can really move forward.
Gosh, that's really interesting. Fascinated by that thought of it's not always the person at the top of the list. You're really considering such a lot of factors there. That's brilliant.
Yeah, and I think one thing to add actually, and it's a really weird situation that we find ourselves in. We have homes that we don't have anyone coming from the local authority is wanting. So we do sometimes go to what we call the open market, so putting properties onto Rightmove for people to apply to, because we don't have anyone coming through from the housing register that wants it, which seems, again, a completely bizarre situation.
Why might that be?
I think there's still an element of preference. People can be in need, but they also, because they know this is their one shot, as it were. Okay. This is my one access in. I will only get this chance once, so I want this to be my forever home. So if, for example, you've got a 2-bedroom high-rise flat, that's not going to be popular. It's not in the location that people want. Yeah, we do have that. So that's part of that 10% that we do need to, once we've gone maybe 3 rounds, which is what's known as basically allocation, and giving it to the council 3 times to ask them to nominate something. Fortunately, ultimately, we can't keep properties empty for an inordinate amount of time. So we do then move to the open market. We do check that customers still meet our access to housing. So they still have to be in housing need. They have to still meet our charitable objectives. But often that can be a different customer mix there. But yeah, again, one of those mad situations where there's not enough housing, but you have empty properties.
Thanks, Holly. That's really interesting. Mark, in our introduction meeting, you suggested a broader rent range between social and market rents could help more people access good quality housing. Would you tell our listeners a bit more about that, please?
Yeah, sure. I think it's just that money needs to come from somewhere in order to increase supply is where it all starts, really, that thought process. And whilst more grant funding is the obvious answer, one of the things I was reflecting on is that the system at the moment for rent levels is just too binary. We have social rent levels that are very low, heavily subsidised and extremely scarce availability. And then we have market rent, which is unaffordable for many working households, especially in London and the South East where I operate. And there's not much viable between that scale, though there have been some attempts in the past with the coalition government bringing in affordable rent. It still hasn't quite been used in that way. And the flexibility's what's not there. And it's where we end up landing local space, because we have to find something that is viable, is affordable within certain criteria, and can work for homeless households that are presenting to the council. So we end up landing at around 70% of market rent on average, always below the local housing allowance, so that the recourse to benefits is not a problem. And we always keep a keen eye on what our rents represent as a percentage of average earnings as one of our sort of true tests to make sure we don't just crank everything up to the local housing allowance. And so we end up at around 36% of average earnings. And you look at social rents now, especially in London, and they're probably 60 to 75% below market rents. And that was never the original intention for them to be that divorced from the market. Admittedly, it was always the original intention for them to be very affordable, and it's that huge separation between what the market now does and what people earn and have as an income that causes the problem. So, yeah, it just strikes me that there are people living in homes who are either subsidised exactly to the amount they need or are over-subsidised. And there's a gap there where flexibility, different rent levels, depending on what happens with household income over the period of time, can generate more income for landlords that can then be invested in new supply or condition. There's a high income social tenant clause in some of regulation, which enables you to charge more as a social landlord if your household that you're dealing with earns above a certain amount. But of course, there's not much power there to find out what people earn, and very difficult to enforce, very difficult to administer, and it hasn't really been taken advantage of by the sector as a result.
Mm-hmm. I think when we were talking sort of pre-episode, Holly, you said, was it 80,000 household could earn and still be sort of on a social housing register, which, sounds like a very comfortable income and maybe doesn't need subsidised or particularly low rents. But like you say, we can't really check out people's bank accounts and start charging them a bit more, can we? That's a really valid point.
And I think that is very much, though, subject to where you live. So I live in Bristol. Stonewater's just recently purchased a lot of stock in Bristol, all at affordable rent, so set at 80% of the market, and you're still looking in excess of £1,000 a month. So whilst actually 80,000 sounds okay as a household, if that's a single earner paying 40% tax, actually once you've outlaid £1,200 on your rent, it doesn't feel as affordable. And I think Mark's right. Half of the issue that we have around the polarisation between social and affordable rent or intermediate rent is then that stops the churn of properties. If you're in a social rent 2-bed, for example, and really you need to be in a 3-bed or a 4-bed, much of the new stock is affordable rent. You're asking someone to effectively double what they're paying to move on to the right property, and it works the other way around as well.
The question that sort of popped up in my mind was, have we protected affordability so tightly that we've destroyed availability in some areas is what I was thinking about. And there was an estate that I used to work on in Hackney that shot to fame when Russell Brand supported a protest there, and the people I worked for at the time ended up introducing a personalised rents policy, which looked at people voluntarily sharing information about their income and the rent being set commensurate to that. And it had a few pillars, such as the more you earn, the more you get to keep, but also the more rent you pay until you reach a market rent. And that worked really well. Lots of people opted into that, and it meant that we ended up making the rent we needed to manage and run the estate without increasing everyone's rent, only the people that could afford to bear the brunt of that. And I suppose there's just something in there for me about, 25%, 45%, 50%, and it being able to change depending on the subsidy that's needed.
Thanks, Mark. I'm interested to hear that people actually opted into that. I would have thought they would kind of protect their, extra income and stuff. But
well, the alternative was,
maybe they're more honest.
a 10% increase, per year until we get to the target rent figure, or opt in, and you won't pay more. You'll pay less or the same.
Okay. Thank you. Right, Peter, we've seen political debate about who deserves a social house, with slogans like British homes for British people resurfacing. How should the sector respond to that kind of rhetoric?
I think some of that would be about just presenting the true data that we have. I mean, if you look at the ethnicity of social home allocations, which is a publicly available statistic, is easily found, it's actually reflective of the population as a whole. I think something like between 80 and 85% of people who are allocated a social home are sort of white British, and that's the same as the population of the UK. And so even when you get to London, which is often where this is discussed, the percentages again reflect the sort of ethnic breakdown of London, and it would be weird. It'd be sort of worth questioning if it didn't really either way, But what you have there is really quite an old trope of far right politics, which is to sort of point to council housing and say, look, it's all going to immigrants. They're getting something. You're having to work very hard to pay your housing bills, but immigrants are getting something for free. And I mean, I think even when you kind of look down further into that data of people who have got a social home and they were born outside the UK, they tend to have been in a country for sort of more than 20 years, have been working in the country, paying tax that whole time, often doing quite a low paid job. And it feels a bit less, it's not views I have, but I think even for people who do feel like there's an unfairness element, I think they're mistaking that for people who've literally just arrived in the country. And actually, because there's kind of local connections tests and so on in most nominations policies, this is very, very unlikely. The asylum seeker accommodation and so on is much more kind of emergency housing and quite grim, quite a lot of it. You're not talking about people who are sort of arriving in the country and immediately being given access to a social home. But I don't think that's very widely understood at all. And even kind of at the top of politics, I don't think that's widely understood. And, as the reform rise as a political force, I think that the best thing the sector can do is actually just make sure that people who are seriously involved in this debate, kind of commentators, policymakers, etc., actually understand what's going on and what debate they're having. I mean, just chipping into the conversation we had before, I do think that there's a danger in trying to tie rents too closely to incomes. It's a policy we saw proposed in the 2010s, not in the same way that Mark is talking about it, but it gets difficult because what do you do? You know, as someone's income starts to rise, are you kind of creating disincentives from getting a pay rise? You know, like it's. I think I can see the need for mid-market tenancies, but I think starting to kind of mess around with the rents people pay based on their incomes rising, or expecting people to sort of move out of social housing once they've stabilized their lives and got a decent job, it's not really, again, what we wanted social housing to be for, which is more of a kind of like stable community, allowing people to get a stable life and have a stable home, and for that to be their home for a while. I think, again, the problems come down to a lack of overall supply, because if you don't have enough social homes, then it's very hard to justify using the subsidy that is around, government subsidy that is around, to kind of fund mid-market products, because the pressure is to help people who are in really extreme circumstances.
Mm-hmm. I'd get your point there about sort of disincentivizing people to make better of their life. I think you sort of see that with like childcare, don't you? And young mothers staying at home to look after the children because actually they end up worse off when they go back to work and that sort of thing. So that's an interesting counterpoint there. Thank you. Really interesting. Let's go to Tim. So you've compared the UK's approach to allocations with models in Europe, and you're regularly updating with HQN. So are there any lessons we could learn from how other countries manage allocations, help improve perception, or anything you just think from your perspective that could improve things?
Okay, I think for a better start by said, I always point out a health warning when we're comparing with other countries, because their social, legal, political systems are different. Even so, most countries in northwestern Europe have a similar problem to us. Lack of affordable social rented housing, lots of people needing social housing who struggle to get it. And my view on this has always been that you don't learn from other countries, and you certainly shouldn't copy what other countries do. But what it does do is generate some ideas of things we might think about. So if I take the example of the Netherlands, a couple of things really strike me about the Netherlands. The first thing is that, of course, the Netherlands doesn't have any council housing. There used to be, many decades ago, local municipal companies. And what they have now as the only providers of social housing is what they call housing corporations, which are more or less similar to our housing associations. What the municipalities have to do is to have an allocations policy, but it's not specified. Each local municipality has different policies. Some have an advertisement model, which we would call choice-based lettings, as we're daft. But the Dutch, and they couldn't believe their ears when I said to them, "Oh, we're going to call it choice-based lettings." They were rolling around on the floor in laughter.
Oh dear.
But others, for example, the city of Breda, has kept a points-based system well into the 21st century. Others have a system where when you join the register and you've gone through the same eligibility and qualification hoops that we set, the applicant has to specify the type of property they want, the area, and they're only informed about anything that becomes available when a vacancy crops up. And that seems an interesting idea. And I know some local authorities and housing associations have adopted that, or elements of that in this country. Others, where there's low demand, and there are low demand areas in this country, in the northeast, have a brokerage system where a tenant negotiates through a broker as to the length of tenancy, the type of property. And I always feel quite empowered when I go to the Netherlands and hear about all these different systems. But one of the most important things is that municipalities fund third-party agencies, voluntary sector agencies, to deliver a lot of the social care, money advice, help and assistance. And unlike this country, where unfortunately we have lots of different agencies, and if you're an applicant, you go from pillar to post trying to get the advice. In the Netherlands, they're multi-purpose agencies. So it's the same agency, whether you've got drug and alcohol abuse, you've got a mental health issue, or you need money advice. So it's all in one building. And that, I think, is quite a good way forward. So as I say, that we can generate, I think, good ideas that are worth testing or thinking about from other countries, but we shouldn't copy what they do because of the different social legal systems.
Yeah, I agree. That sounds really interesting. It sounds like a very adaptable kind of system, and like they're taking the best approach for whichever region they're in. And I like the idea of those support systems or services being in one place rather than scattered all over and hard to pick up. I think that's sort of something that we see, is that housing associations are being called on to kind of deliver more of those services, aren't they? So we're already stretched in finding houses and dealing with basic housing issues. And then you've got to add on all the other bits and pieces. So, yeah, really interesting. Thanks, Tim. Holly, when we were chatting before about this episode, you said something that surprised me, and that was that people don't realise that they're eligible for social housing or assume it's not for them. So would you share that with our listeners? What are your thoughts on how landlords and councils can change that perception?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it all comes from this misconception about who lives in social housing now and who is allocated social housing, and the stigma that unfortunately still surrounds social housing. And when we say that, we mainly mean rented. Obviously, we offer social housing equally with affordable home ownership products. So one of the key areas, and it's interesting, obviously, what Peter says, is around ethnic minorities. I've spoken to a number of local authorities over the last couple of years where actually their housing register is not reflective of their communities. And they're really struggling with ensuring that people from ethnic minorities understand that the housing register is there, access it, utilise it. And that's equally reflective in Stonewater's own customer population. It's not the same as the overall UK population. It's something we've been very conscious of. EDI is top of our agenda, and we've been actively working on that for as long as my time here, so 9 years, and before, in actually how do we promote that? So in discussions with the local authorities is it around how you access the housing register? So many housing registers now are online. Is that as inclusive as it needs to be? Is choice-based letting bidding as inclusive as it needs to be? How do we promote in those communities? Are we building in the right places? Very often for people of ethnic minorities, they live in very close communities. And if we're building 10 miles away, actually, that's not what they want. We want to stay within that community and have that all of that support surrounding you. So I think that's really important, actually, to shout for everyone, and no matter whether it's just because of an ethnic minority or whether you're working. Again, I think that's a massive misconception. Stonewater does have 52% of our customers are in receipt of full housing costs, but actually the other 48% are working in some way that they either get partial or no housing funding. So many of our households are in full-time work. So how do we make sure that those people know that there is such a thing as affordable housing and that social housing is for them and they can access the housing registers and bid? Sometimes it might take them longer, but it is still an option for them. And I think, again, that's really important with our new build sites where we're working on local lettings plans with the local authorities. So there we do actually stipulate that we will have X amount of the households will be working full-time. Again, to try and create those communities that will really thrive together, a mix of people from different backgrounds and different experiences to really bring it all together. But yet social housing, I think, is for everyone, no matter your age, your lifestyle. It's for when you need it. And we need to make sure that actually people that maybe have never needed it before, that then experience some sort of crisis, know that's where you should turn, and don't just suffer in silence, as it were, struggling to make ends meet and being evicted potentially from the private rented sectors. So I think it is all about going back to challenging those stigmas and just, correcting that within society as to who is really being housed.
I'm circling around that point you made about different types of communities, and you said they like to live sort of close together and stuff. It's just surprising to me the level of thought that goes into how we might accommodate people or find them homes or where we might build and that sort of thing. It's fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's fine. And I think obviously Stonewall does a lot of rural development, for example.
Yeah.
And actually, if you consider rural development and actually who tends to move in, that's some of the contributors. It's trying to create that. It's understanding that we also need inner city development, which is so tricky because there's just not the space to be able to create that. But I think for me and my work within lettings, it is about creating sustainable tenancies, and we misunderstand the element that support networks around people really do bring. And that's just as important as the property itself.
Yeah, thank you. Peter, on that thought, with so many people waiting years for a home, how can the media help shift the public conversation from blame to understanding?
I think that the conversation maybe has shifted a bit away from blame. I think it's kind of fairly widely accepted now, maybe more so than it was a decade or so ago, that there is, especially in kind of inner city areas and so on, that there's a big problem with unaffordable rents. And, it's pretty clear that sort of even a basic public sector salary, for example, isn't enough to rent a home in a city like London or even Bristol or Manchester these days. So I think people maybe aren't blamed so much for kind of looking for social housing. I would like to kind of see social housing thought of, and, ideally you'd want a social housing system which feels the same as using education or healthcare, both of which are also provided by the public sector to an extent. Yet nobody kind of feels any sense of stigma about sending a child to a state school or using an NHS hospital because they need it. And so I think that the attitude I'd like to see kind of society adopt is that if you find yourself in a position where you need housing and you face, maybe if you face homelessness, but also if you just face the position of being unable to afford your housing costs, then it's totally normal to look to social housing as something that could help you at that point in your life, as opposed to, it's something for people who've kind of failed in life in some way, which is I guess, sometimes how it's been talked about in the past. Although, I think, and to sort of be a broken drum, a broken record about this, I think that you don't, because NHS hospitals are widely available, even if they're struggling a bit, and because the education system's in decent shape, it doesn't feel like you're getting something which isn't available to other people. And so when a kind of social resource is very limited and therefore restricted, there's a whole range of emotions that come about when people get it, because it means other people don't have it. So then you get resentment and people feeling like maybe they don't deserve it and that sort of thing. So, it would feel a lot better. I don't think it did used to feel like this necessarily in the 1980s when, say, I think 34% of London was social housing in the 1980s. Yeah, so slightly above a third of people lived in social housing. And then I think it's just when it's at that kind of level, it's just very much a normalized part of the housing process. And many people will spend a few years in social housing and then maybe buy, or they'll form communities that they'll stay in, and it doesn't have that same kind of a negative association perhaps that it does today. So yeah, I think maybe for the media, just kind of just not thinking about social housing and talking about social housing in these kind of like grand and sometimes sort of slightly horrified terms, but just considering it a normal way to live, just as private renting and owning a home is.
Yeah.
Pete's right. It used to be mainstream infrastructure. That was the intention. It's not supposed to be residual and rationed. And your point about when something is rationed, then envy and other things like that creep in from the rest of the population doesn't get it is certainly one factor. The other thing that I would remark on is where it's rationed, as we've just discussed, it's rationed to the people that need it most. And so you do end up with cohorts of people, and all of a sudden there's this stigma that comes along because social housing is for people with problems. And it's such a difficult cycle to break that you need to give it to those who need it most. And then there's a judgment that comes with that, you know.
I think I'd just add it's a really interesting concept because forever in society you have people organise themselves into what is perceived to be the haves and the have-nots. Mm-hmm. And then interestingly, actually, it's the have-nots that have become the haves within social housing. So actually that's how they're perceived. And, and some of the pressures on the housing registers, because of the demand and that local authorities are really struggling to keep up with the number of customers trying to register, actually they've made their own criteria even stricter. So they've reduced, for example, the maximum you can earn to say £20,000 or £25,000. So again, their creation of that, because they can't manage them and they know they're not going to house them, is therefore making it feel to people that there is that squeezed middle. There's that group of customers that actually really can't afford housing on the open market, but I also can't access there. And the polarisation then of communities, and actually there is a lot of people that are the have-not but can't quite get there. But yeah, I think that's really interesting. You would never question someone and say, well, you use the hospital much more than I do, or you've been to the doctors much more than me, I deserve a refund and some help. So why do we look at housing in such a different way?
Yeah, Holly, I think you've exactly drawn that out from what Pete was saying. It's a great point. Mark, on the thought of long waiting lists, you mentioned that some people remain heavily subsidised homes long after their circumstances improve. In some ways, your earlier point around changing financial situations and rent based on income is valid, but are there any other policy changes you think that could help with this situation?
Oh, I'm not sure. Other policy changes. I certainly think a couple of clarifications I would put in are that I think of any policy that forces people to move out of their home because they've reached a certain income bracket or something like that is problematic. That's that people's homes, as Pete talked about, are personal to them. They're where they build their community links. So I absolutely think it's about the income change from that property is the contribution that could be made to better viability and greater supply. And then I think the other thing that's really important to make any success of that kind of policy is that it needs to reward people for earning more. It can't be that the more you earn, the worse things get for you. So it needs to be a win-win for the landlord's rent roll and their investment in future supply, and also for the household that live there. And to do that, it is complicated. You have to avoid cliff edges. Holly talked about reducing, some people have reduced income caps to £20,000 before you're in, but there's just so many people that fall off of that cliff edge but still need help. And so it's administratively burdensome, but then so is assessing lots of benefit claims. And I suppose the big point I'd make is that, the money's got to come from somewhere, and the public purse is already paying for this problem in temporary accommodation costs and hotel bills, and you go further than that, and the emergency services impact, because Beveridge, when he brought everything together, was quite clear that poor quality housing was a cause of poverty, not just a side effect of it. So I think for me, it's about the money's already being spent. Shouldn't we just try and spend it better, rather than it lining the pockets of various hotel owners at the moment?
Okay, thanks, Mark. Holly, what do you think? The volume of homes we need is a long way off. So how can we create more churn within social housing, and what would a fair and future system look like to you?
So I think you've nailed it there. It is about churn. And unfortunately, what we have within our current system, and I touched on it earlier around the polarisation of rents, nothing helps people and supports people to move. Moving house is really daunting. Moving house is really difficult for anyone. But actually being able to access social housing and progress through it as your life circumstances change is really important. But the scarcity also drives those within it to remain in their current property because they can't access a more appropriate one. So you see this in older people whose children have left home, still residing in a 3 or a 4 bedroom house with no need for that, and then being penalised with bedroom tax because that's apparently the kind of solution is to use the stick and not the carrot to tell people, well, if I make it harder for you to live there, then you'll move. But actually what we find is it's not that, and it's not even about the money for people. It's again about that they have lived there for 20 years. They have built their life around there. They understand that community. The prospect of just packing up everything, often you don't have the support networks. It's just too much to comprehend, and therefore it's not even attempted. Plus, actually, just trying to get to, for example, a 2-bed is very hard for them on the housing register, even though they're going to free up a 3-bed. So it's about local authorities thinking of better ways to actually support people in freeing up those larger properties, making sure that people move through. So if you've got able to free up a 4-bed, someone in a 3-bed moves to a 4, the 2-bed moves to the 3, and the 1-bed moves there. I think one of the things that I definitely see is even within our local authorities, they're really struggling between departments. So you will have a property available and you'll have adult social care competing with homelessness, competing with those that run the actual housing register, and everyone wanting that property, all from the same organisation. And then as a landlord, we're being forced to choose between them. And actually, it feels like I say, as a society, we need to all come together a bit more, whether that be equally local authorities coming together. You obviously have local connection criteria and everyone is incentivized over their area and their KPI and what they're doing. But actually, come back to the piece of how have we got homes empty in certain areas, yet in other areas we've got maybe 10% of those in needs able to be housed. As a country, we need to be better able to cross borders, move support, etc., and use what stock we do have to be able to house those people most in need and ensure that they've got the support networks there as well to be able to move freely between those areas.
Thank you, Holly. That was interesting. Again, gosh, I'm learning such a lot, and yeah, getting away with more questions, I think. You have given me such a lot to think about. I think the greatest problem of all is the shortage of homes, which is driving this perception of social housing being for the most needy, and then the frustration at the system. It's clear there isn't an easy answer, but perhaps we've helped to offer a little bit more transparency about how it works and who social housing is really for. Thank you to my guests, Holly, Tim, Mark and Peter, for joining me, and thank you everybody for listening.
We hope you enjoyed listening to the latest episode of On the Air. We'll be publishing a new episode again soon. To stay up to date, subscribe to our channel. Thanks again for listening, and don't forget to share your thoughts with us on LinkedIn by typing #SW on the air.